We'll go ahead and get started. And just want to welcome you all. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. I know many of you are joining from across the globe, so we're excited to have you here. I'm Abigail Howell, and I work with World Vision International. I'm the Gender Equality and Social Inclusion Director for World Vision International. And I have the wonderful privilege of moderating today's webinar. Before we get into it, I want to mention a few housekeeping details for this webinar. So as we're going through the webinar, please keep your videos and your microphones off. We can ensure our speakers have the best possible bandwidth. And secondly, if you have questions, you can add them. There's a Q&A button where you can ask your questions, or you can put them in the chat if you can't find the question and answer button in Zoom. And we'll have a question and answer session at the end of the webinar, so we'll be able to address some of your questions. Also, finally, actually, we have a Ukrainian translation that's available. So you can press on the translation or interpretation button in Zoom. But just so you know, there was not an option to write in Ukrainian as a interpretation option on Zoom. So please select French to join the correct interpretation panel. And apologies about the inconvenience with that. All right, so moving on from the housekeeping, as many of you know, we're in the middle of the 16 days of activism to eliminate gender-based violence. And during this time of year, activists from around the world are joining together to influence policy, raise awareness, address drivers of gender-based violence. I'm really excited that we have this webinar to link to the global campaign. Our webinar today is really going to look at the situation of gender-based violence in Ukraine and the impact it's having on women and girls. We'll hear starting kind of an opening about the situation in Ukraine, and then we'll move into hearing about what is happening in Ukraine and how one of World Vision's partner NGOs, NGO Girls, is responding to the needs in the country. We will then kind of take a deep dive into a study on GBV in Ukraine that highlights the unique experiences and needs that women and adolescent girls and boys have related to gender-based violence. We'll hear some key findings and recommendations for governments, donors, civil society. Then we'll hear a few more findings that are related specifically to adolescents and hear about what World Vision does related to gender-based violence prevention and response with adolescents. Then finally, we'll hear from a colleague from World Vision US on their priorities related to gender-based violence prevention and response. And to close off the webinar, we'll have a time of question and answer. So as questions come up, please put them in the Q&A box or in the chat, and we can seek to answer those at the Q&A time. And before jumping into the agenda, the full webinar, I want to recognize that talking about gender-based violence can be difficult, and even when the topic is presented academically. We know that gender-based violence is a pervasive issue around the world, and it is deeply personal. So I know that some of us on this call may have experienced gender-based violence or may know others who experience it and may be triggered by this conversation, which is very understandable. So please be sure to take care of yourself and seek support from others if you're noticing you're feeling upset or triggered by the conversation. All right, so it's my pleasure to introduce Armin Grigorian, who's the Operations Director from World Vision Ukraine Response. Armin will give us an overview of the current context in Ukraine, how it is impacting women and girls, and what a World Vision Ukraine Response is doing to respond to their needs. So Armin, I'm excited to invite you to speak to us this morning or this afternoon, evening. So over to you.
Thanks, Abigail. Thanks, and greetings to everyone. Very honored to be invited here and to kind of provide some of the insights that what World Vision Ukraine is doing and how we're working on that. So just maybe a couple of elements just to highlight. So yeah, I mean, just to give a little bit background on the context and challenges. So the impact of the war is big on gender, on GBV in general, and over 8 million basically displaced people, with 60% being women and girls, where basically as a result of the displacement, we are seeing basically the increasing risk of GBV, including exploitation and domestic violence. Economic instability, so women's unemployment rate is higher than men, increasing vulnerabilities to violence and exploitation. I think it's at the rate of 9.7% now. So barriers to support: only 20% of survivors of sexual violence have received medical care, and limited access to psychosocial support, legal service, and reproductive health care. So I think generally speaking, gender-based violence, as all of you know, is basically violation of human rights with great and negative consequences on individuals and families and communities. And the war in Ukraine disproportionately also affects women and girls, exposing them to higher risks of sexual violence, exploitation, and abuse. I think one of the things that World Vision is trying to do is basically to raise awareness about that and to work closely with our partners on that, because it requires a collective action in general. So we are committed strongly to do so, and we are working together with different partners by fostering basically through our interventions, through education, protection, and gender equality. World Vision is working to empower women and girls on that. So as it requires collective action, we engage widely with our partners locally. And yeah, I mean, also this is a very cross-cutting theme across all UCR basically interventions through which are reflected in our strategic objectives. So we do that through different type of, for example, the interventions that we do is mostly psychosocial support, which is trauma-informed care for gender-based violence survivors to address distress and promote healing. And then through safe spaces and halfway houses, where World Vision and through the partners are doing the bulk of the job on that, providing a secure environments where women and girls can access legal advice, counseling, and protection. We also operate through non-formal education, where there are programs for young girls to regain stability and hope through learning opportunities. And we also operate through, again, through the partners to overcome the distress, so through the child-friendly spaces where we worked with the partners to help the beneficiaries and women and girls to overcome the distress related to psychosocial and other protection issues that are encountering as a result. So all of this is to say that we, by recognizing this problem, we are trying to work jointly where we can with all the stakeholders engaged into that, so that we can reach the impact of this to be stronger. So we already, for example, out of 2 million people reached by World Vision UCR Ukraine in Ukraine, more than half of them are women and girls, supported through different interventions that we are doing that I mentioned above. And this is one of the elements that we want to continue doing, and this is why this is part of our strategic interventions, where we try to do women empowerment through different livelihood opportunities, as I mentioned, through different centers where we work for women and girls to regain some stability in that and to be able to stand strongly on their feet. I think that that would be probably it from my end, not to take too much time, maybe also to reflect later on through the question and answer session. So back to you, Abigail.
Thank you, Armin, and thanks for highlighting the important work that World Vision Ukraine and partners are doing to address the needs in Ukraine. You know, it sounds like you've really sought to understand what needs are there and respond to those needs. So it's great to hear what you're doing. All right. I'm going to turn it over now and first introduce our next speaker who will provide opening remarks. So I'd like to welcome Yulia Sporshich, founder of NGO Girls in Ukraine. Yulia, it's great to have you with us to provide opening remarks and to tell us more about what is happening in Ukraine related to gender-based violence and how NGO Girls is responding. So over to you, Yulia.
Yes, thank you so much. Good day. I don't know in which time zone you are. I'm Yulia, and I'm running NGO Girls in Ukraine. And the main purpose of creating NGO Girls, it was GBV prevention. And we are the main actor in Ukraine who is doing sexual education in school, and we advocating it to introduce this in a state program. But also we, for many years already, 3 years, we are partnering with World Vision. And when we came with the idea to find out what is going on and with GBV in Ukraine and where is the real data, how many survivors we have, do people realize that sometimes they are survivors and they are not seeking help, or how many people are seeking help in Ukraine. We didn't have this data in Ukraine before, so we initiate this national-wide research, and huge thanks to Eleanor, to Arman, and to Kate, because only with your support it happened. And it's what I would like to highlight, that it's the only one national-wide research on GBV, and we are going to spread it out and to bring this data on Ukrainian program on GBV prevention, and also as we are very active on humanitarian response, we also sharing this information with other stakeholders like NGO platform participants or alliance, and also with the state, just to be sure that all programs related to GBV is based on the fresh, reliable data, and we can create really quality projects and survive-centered and to use survive-centered approach for all our programs. And I know that many of other players, they are so happy to have this data. And my main thanks to the World Vision that we were able to do it. And Arman already highlighted what is happening right now in GBV in Ukraine, but I would like to bring the perspective of adolescents girls, and I know that you will discuss a lot about it. But right now we need to think how we can create a safe spaces for girls and to give them chance to develop their reproductive health in a good condition. So what we would like to do is that all prevention activities crucial, and we need to introduce it not only in formal education but in formal, and also to fight the stigma around, and the stigma is often brought in by teachers and parents. So we also need to take into account that we need to work with experts, with child protection experts all around Ukraine, and to focus on people who are caring about kids and about adolescents. I'm so sorry because I need to travel, and I wish you a very good event. And Darina Ivchenko is staying with you, and she's able to answer all questions related to our program later. And over to you.
Great. Thank you, Yulia, for your time. I know you're in the midst of travel, so we appreciate you joining us and speaking to us. And it's amazing the initiative you took as an organization to see a gap in what was available, a barrier that's kind of prohibiting the work to address GBV and address that gap. And the report, the research that you did, really the spotlight on adolescent girls is amazing because they're often overlooked, globally in understanding their experiences and needs related to sexual and gender-based violence. So this research that you initiated is quite an amazing bit of research. And with that, I'm excited now to introduce our next panelist, our next speaker, who will be highlighting giving an overview of the report and the methodology, findings, recommendations, and also talk a bit about the impact that NGO Girls has had while disseminating the report and findings in Ukraine. So I'd like to introduce Darnya Ivachenko, and over to you, Darnya.
Thank you very much. Yeah, my name is Darina. I'm Darina Ivchenko. I'm Advocacy and Partnership Manager at NGO Girls. Thank you a lot thank you World Vision to organizing this event, and thank you every participant for joining. The fact that you are already here means a lot, and we do hope that this findings that we'll present you'll find relevant to your work, and of course no data can be reliable without the proper tools. So before we dive into more thorough and deeper presentation, I would like to give a bit of an overview of the methodology tools that we used. So we tried to use as comprehensive approach as possible, because the aim was to capture diverse perspective of gender-based violence in Ukraine. So there were 16 focus group discussions conducted separately with women, men, girls, and boys. Then there was a stage with key informant interviews where we included community representatives, human rights defenders, NGO workers, psychologists, police, and the list goes on and on. With this stage, it allowed us to have more professional and community level insights. And then based on these two stages, we developed a big online survey through which we reached around 3,000 people. The participants were from all Ukrainian regions. We also tried to ensure the equal coverage of both rural and urban areas, but also representation of different income levels. So the combination of these tools, in our opinion, helped us to have so-called well-rounded understanding of GBV. And now I would like to share with you some perceptions. So please, the next slide. Perceptions of gender-based violence, mostly related to women, but also men. So as we discovered, they really depend and vary on age, region, gender, but also participants' experiences. So women from South and East, they more frequently associate GBV with physical actions, while women from western part of Ukraine view it more holistically, because they also mentioned that psychological and financial abuse, that is a GBV. Men stated that they perceive gender-based violence as a violation of human rights, but they mostly recognize it as violence when it's a sexual or physical, so-called extreme manifestations of that. Besides, one of the goals of this research was to see the changes after the invasion started, because as we know, the number of reported cases of violence, it increased almost twice in 2023. But surprisingly, there are also positive changes because of that. So women stated that they became more aware of violence and unfair gender norms, that they are more quicker to notice some warning signs, some triggers. But there are also a lot of challenges, unfortunately. So women from rural areas or those with low income, they stated that they don't know about support services, almost don't know, it's like more than around 5-7%, or they doubt that they will work. Fear of stigma, also as previous colleagues mentioned, prevents many from seeking help. And now I would like to show and to share some shocking numbers. So 76% of those who experienced sexual violence over the past year did not ask for help, because they either doubted support services or they did not know about any. 20% of those who experienced sexual violence blamed themselves for that, and only 12% of those who experience psychological and economic violence recognize it as such, while others did not attach importance, or they felt that it's something bad, but they didn't recognize it as violence. Now, I would like to talk a bit about the impact of GBV on women with personal experience of violence, because those who have been in abusive relationship, they tend to see GBV as a part of larger societal issues rather than some individual deviations. That was also quite a discovery for us. Those who experience GBV show more active approach to discussing this topic with children. Many women stated that when GBV starts to touch on children, it becomes the turning point for them to break the silence. And one woman shared, "The last straw was when my ex-husband pushed my child very hard and pulled me by the hair in front of the child. That was the last straw." Nevertheless, there are some positive changes. So we observed that the respondents, they becoming more aware of GBV, with more men becoming feeling more empathetic towards survivors. And this can be connected to the reveal of many Russian war crimes. But these changes, unfortunately, are quite slow. So to address GBV, we need a lot of teamwork between humanitarian sector, CSOs, governments, and communities. So this includes improving access to support, raising awareness, and removing a lot of existing barriers. Now I would like to share a few key recommendations. So I would like to ask to go to the next slide. If you open the full research, we have a lot of pages on which you can see specific recommendations developed to targeted programs, to advocacy, to policy changes. So you can choose the ones that you find the most relevant to use them for your work. We do recommend to do so. What I would like to highlight is that there should be more educational programs, and as Yulia mentioned, formal and informal. And these programs should be developed according to the regional age and gender specific needs, because there cannot be one unified program for all of the people. Secondly, it's essential to work on targeted programs to work with perpetrators, as these initiatives should focus on changing behaviors and addressing the root causes of GBV. And after that, we can work on mitigating it. And the last but not least, it's the advocacy for increased funding, as is in 2023, only 1% of funding was allocated to GBV programs. And in 2024, there are around 2.5 million people needing support. So we need an urgent action in this matter. So by prioritizing these steps, education, targeted interventions, but also adequate funding, we can all work toward creating a safer and more supportive environment. Thank you a lot. And also I encourage you to use the findings of the presentation in your work. And that's all from my side.
Thank you so much. And the research and findings, like I mentioned, are so important. And what you highlighted about the importance of making sure response and efforts are focused, based on age, region, and the needs in those specific areas, not doing a one kind of size fits all approach is really key. And with that, that's a perfect segue to go to Gidya Krisht, who is the World Vision Impact Evidence Advisor for the Middle East and Eastern Europe region. And she'll be giving an overview of the specific findings from the research that are linked to adolescents, with a focus on adolescent girls. So Gidya, over to you.
Thank you so much, Abigail. And at first, I'd like to thank the organizers of the webinar and the panel itself, as well as Girls, the NGO, the Ukrainian NGO, for co-producing this important study. Also, deep gratitude to all for their relentless fight against GBV, and to those who work tirelessly to bring justice to GBV survivors worldwide. and to you all for renewing your commitment to raising awareness and taking action towards ending GBV. I'm going to share the findings from Silent Battles, a study that explores specifically Ukrainian adolescents' understanding and experiences of GBV. And in a context of ongoing crises like the one in Ukraine, adolescents face unique challenges and risks related to violence. The study specifically addresses a critical gap in understanding adolescents' unique vulnerabilities to GBV across a representative sample covering Ukraine nationwide using a mixed method approach. And between February and March, we conducted 1,200 surveys with boys and girls aged 13 to 17 across rural and urban contexts in Ukraine, including 44% who were in fact affected by the war and 11% from frontline areas. The sample included 56% who were younger adolescents, 44% who were older adolescents. It explored awareness, experiences, and perceptions of GBV, focusing on gender roles, power dynamics, as well as societal influences. We also conducted 6 focus group discussions, 3 with each boys separately and girls, to delve deeper into personal experiences and cultural perceptions of GBV. And using stratified sampling, we ensured representation by age, gender, and geography. Then descriptive analysis was applied to survey data and thematic analysis to the qualitative data for a comprehensive understanding of how conflict shapes adolescents' experiences and perceptions of GBV. So let's dive into the key findings, starting with how adolescent boys and girls understand GBV. Psychological violence emerges as the most prevalent form of GBV, affecting 63% of the sample. Boys primarily associate GBV with physical violence, domination, and subordination in relationships, viewing it as a violation of personal freedom. Interestingly, though, 81% of all adolescents do not seek help for psychological violence. And there's a lack of targeted information and low awareness of available services, which limits their access to support. Both boys and girls tend to rely heavily on parents at 83% and friends at 75% for support. However, they are often reluctant to discuss GBV, especially sexual violence. Notably, boys at 35% struggle more than girls at 25% to actually identify GBV's root causes. This might not be surprising, given that girls experience GBV at higher rates and exhibit greater confidence in pinpointing its causes. Relying exclusively on family for GBV prevention and protection creates complexity, as families may not always be equipped to address these issues effectively. And we can see also that 82% of adolescents do not trust religious leaders or community leaders at 80%. Next slide, please. So the effects of GBV on adolescents are profound and have enduring impact, with girls identified as the most vulnerable across the sample. Girls are more likely than boys to recognize different forms of violence across the GBV types and to have experienced them. And we all know that adolescence is marked already by a lot of transformation, both physical, emotional, and mental changes. And girls are more likely to identify psychological violence as in fact harmful and as an actual form of GBV, whereas boys often would dismiss it, not recall it, or completely dissociate. Among those who reported psychological violence, only 10% of the boys identified as GBV compared to 18%. Girls are also more likely to think that they caused the harm themselves. Self-blame, 21% of girls versus 4% of boys. And also, they're more likely and prone to increased anxiety at 24% versus 9% of girls. The psychological toll is severe. Overall, 26% report a loss of self-confidence, and then 21% experience obsessive thoughts, and 17% report heightened anxiety. As one girl in a focus group discussion put it, physical violence leaves traces on the body, moral violence marks the soul. So this reflection underscores the lasting psychological scars that GBV leaves on adolescents, particularly in the context of war and trauma. Next slide, please. Which brings us to the fact that conflict amplifies these vulnerabilities, especially for those directly impacted by conflict, for example, displaced adolescents who face the greatest risks. In our study, 17% of the adolescents reported threats of sexual violence. That is a huge number. And those in frontline or conflict-affected areas were more likely to experience violence and identify gender roles as a root cause. So some key findings on root causes. 35% of girls versus 21% of boys believe GBV stems from traditional norms. 25% of girls versus 13% of boys would link GBV to unequal power dynamics in the society. And then 15% of girls versus 7% of boys reject the idea that GBV is actually provoked by specific situations. In fact, girls unanimously agreed that it's always the perpetrator's fault. And adolescents from urban areas demonstrated greater awareness of these links than those living in rural areas. Also, living conditions, especially those affected by the war, in regions like Eastern Ukraine, they highlighted war as a major contributor to GBV. Next slide, please. And that brings us to the critical question: what can we do to address these issues? I quote, "They came to school to talk about it, but I wouldn't say it was great. I would say it was boring, uninteresting. They didn't tell us the scale of it. They didn't tell us that every person first faces it every day." This is a girl participant in one of the focus group discussions. So adolescents, especially girls, face unique vulnerabilities that demand urgent and tailored interventions with specialized access for GBV case management in the case of survivors, and then also considering children with disabilities facing heightened risks. But some key actions that we can take is on the government level, scaling up adolescent-focused GBV programs, safe spaces, as Yulia mentioned, mental health services, and awareness campaigns to reduce the stigma. Donors need to prioritize funding for sustainable adolescent-centered GBV interventions. And we must advocate for adolescent-specific solutions while collaborating with both adolescent and women-led organizations. Finally, addressing their battles with GBV requires comprehensive, well-funded, and adolescent-centered interventions that would disrupt normative practices, centering adolescent voices and needs at the heart of our efforts. This research highlights that the silent battles faced by adolescent girls during the war in Ukraine is quite worthy of all of our attention almost immediately. Thank you for your attention.
Great, thank you, Hida. And this was very, very interesting to see kind of the experience of adolescence. And like I mentioned, and we've heard before, adolescents are often overlooked in GBV prevention and response, kind of lumped into broader responses. And we're seeing and hearing that that's not appropriate. And so the findings from this research is really interesting. And, you know, I was struck by the difference between boys and girls and some of the data, such as, you know, the difference of girls feeling like a higher proportion of girls feeling like violence is their fault. And I was also kind of struck as you were talking about the limited trust adolescents have in community and faith leaders. And that's quite an important bit of information that really highlights for me the importance of understanding who actually influences adolescents and who they trust and will reach out to when planning actions to prevent and respond to GBV. And we know that, you know, and we're hearing that interventions aren't often tailored to the needs and interests of adolescents. So the importance of working with adolescent-led organizations and women's organizations to really appropriately tailor programming is so important. Now I'm going to introduce our next panelist, who's Julia Smith-Brake, the Senior Advisor for Adolescent Programming and Education at World Vision International. Will be giving us an overview of World Vision's approach to gender-based violence prevention and response with adolescents, while commenting on the recommendations of the reports and the findings and recommendations there. So Julia, over to you.
Thank you so much, Abby, and thank you to all of our colleagues and our partners. It's rare that we get such depth of results and recommendations that are specific to adolescents, and so this is a grand occasion, and I'm really excited for what this can mean for us, showing colleagues and other partners what can be done with adolescents. But I also just wanted to take a few minutes and respond a little bit about what we're doing in World Vision already around adolescents, and especially around protection, violence, and GBV. But I wanted to start just by saying that in our programming and in our frameworks, we really acknowledge and bring into account the fact that adolescence is a critical time to address gender inequality. I'm sharing in the chat a really good article that kind of gives us the basis around this argument. And the article was a meta-analysis that looked across different contexts around what happens in adolescence around gender norms and gender inequality specifically. And if we're going to address gender-based violence, then addressing gender inequality needs to be at the foundation of that. And what has been found across the world is that gender norms as a social norm, or as a group of social norms, are well entrenched by late adolescence. So by the time that boys and girls are 16 or 17 years old, they have already internalized a lot of the social norms that they are learning and observing around them. And so we believe in World Vision that in order to walk alongside adolescents, their caregivers and parents and communities for transformative change, we really need to be targeting younger boys and girls, and not starting our gender analysis, gender mainstreaming, and gender targeted programming in later adolescence. But in fact, inequalities are not inevitable. And so early adolescence, even around 10, 11, but especially around that transition from primary to secondary school, is a huge window of opportunity to address early inequalities and to entrench new and positive behaviors and attitudes. So I'm going to do a brief overview of our two main frameworks that we use. So our global approach to adolescent programming is positive youth development. And so it is based on the body of research and evidence, both in theory and in practice, that young people do not develop in silos. They develop with internal capacity, inherent assets, and then through the relationships, the opportunities for learning, and the targeted programming that we engage in through communities and through partners, there is a dynamic interaction that then happens where adolescents are both contributing to their own development, but also contributing to the well-being and development of those around them. And so this dynamic interaction within their socio-ecological environment allows for developmental success. So we use 4 domains of positive youth development in our programming. So what that basically means is that in any type of programming, we're trying to target 4 different domains in an adolescent's life. We're looking at increasing their assets, so be that skills or competencies or resources, internal assets and external assets that they need in order to be productive and healthy and engaged. We also, through these programs, are looking at enhancing their agency. So this is also through life skills, through social emotional learning, and through connection with others. We're trying to empower them with positive sense of self, a power within, and strong and strengthening self-efficacy. So assets and agency are two of the main kind of driving forces behind our programming. But then in order for young people to internalize their learning, they need to be able to contribute to the world around them, and they need to know that they can put into practice their assets and agency. And so contribution is a domain wherein we are giving young people the opportunity to participate meaningfully and make a positive change in their communities. And then, of course, the enabling environment is absolutely critical. So whether that is relationships, policies, services, it's safe spaces and safe environment for adolescents to grow in. You can go to the next slide. The other framework that we use is around our GESI domains, our gender equality and social inclusion domains. And so these are the domains that we use to mainstream social inclusion across all of our programming. And those 5 domains are also within the larger context of agency, transformation, and empowerment. And so if you look at those 5 domains, I won't go into these in depth, but what I will do is if you go to the next slide, I'm going to show you a little bit of an alignment of how we have looked at our GESI domains and our PYD domains. And so when we're looking at GBV or gender equality programming with adolescents, there is a really beautiful alignment between these domains. And so, for example, in our GESI framework, decision-making is one of the domains of change, and in our PYD framework, that is also around agency, but also contribution. And so I'm hoping that you can see that there is an alignment here in how we're developing our programming that is not just targeting adolescents, but targeting social inclusion of adolescents. And so what you might see in our adolescent GBV programming is we will probably have life skills, social and emotional learning, and sexual reproductive health and rights interventions. And so you can see the 2 domains that are contributing to those. We also really implement these safe and inclusive spaces. We need spaces where boys and girls can feel like they are safe, like they have access to safe relationships and safe services. We also have meaningful participation in community initiatives. And so that's a way where participation and contribution can come to light. In terms of safe and inclusive reporting and referral, and as well as responsive caregiving and safe and inclusive services, all of this is part of, in PYD, what would be the enabling environment, and in our GESI framework would be access and systems. And so it's not just about increasing skills, but it's also about providing opportunities to participate in decisions, participate in advocating for better youth-friendly services, better policies, and then also bringing parents, caregivers, other trusted adults in the community around them. If you can go to the next slide, I'll just wrap up around just reflecting on the recommendations. I think that the recommendations of this report, we really need to sit with these and put these into practice. Programming that takes into account girls' and boys' unique perspectives and experiences and vulnerabilities is so important. And looking at the disparity between girls' experiences and boys' experiences in this Ukraine research is so important to really take into account, especially in this instance, girls' perspectives and experiences. But we also need programming that is working to build relationships between boys and girls and not see them as separate or treat them separately in all of our programming. Dividing between gender can have some benefits on certain topics. There's maybe some topics around sexual reproductive health and rights where having girls only groups and boys only groups could be effective, but we should not only have separate girls and boys groups, but really bringing them together so that they can learn how to stand up for each other, that gender norms affect both of them. And then also I would also say that strengthening our bystander intervention approach, especially with boys in this circumstance, could really strengthen that relationship between boys and girls to prevent, but then also draw attention to and respond to GBV. And finally, our main approach and world vision for adolescent empowerment is called Impact Plus. It's a life skills and active citizenship approach. It's a positive youth development model that builds the foundation of development, relationships, safe and inclusive spaces, and also protective skills to recognize, prevent, and report violence. And then we also have different modules and content that can be plugged in depending on the context. And we've just piloted a new mental well-being module in a girls empowerment program. And so bringing in the psychosocial support elements into this active citizenship base is the foundation of our adolescent and GBV approach. Thank you so much. Back to you, Abby.
Great, thanks, Julia. And thanks for that great overview of adolescent programming, kind of key, kind of the foundations to the approach in World Vision. And you highlighted some really interesting things to think about, such as, not just separating boys and girls and doing things separately with them, but bringing them together, because that does have some transformative impact on their relationships and how they interact with one another. So yeah, some great things to think about. With that, I'm going to ask Karen Ord from World Vision US. She's our next and final panelist. She's the Senior Director for Gender Equality and Social Inclusion at World Vision US, and she will give us an overview of how World Vision in the United States is prioritizing addressing gender-based violence in its fundraising and programming in conflict settings. So, Karen, over to you.
Thanks, Abby. Thanks so much. And thank you to all those other panelists. It's been a really interesting set of speakers and findings. And I always say, in working in gender equality, I can't believe that 50 years after we started working in gender equality, we're still working in gender equality, but here we are. And I think some of those findings and recommendations from the reports are really pointing the way to some aspects, some approaches that we can use to be successful in changing the incidence of gender-based violence and how we address it, approach it, and support the survivors. Just move to the next slide, please. Just wanted to say that World Vision has a global strategy, which my World Vision partners on this call will know well, called Our Promise. And it has 5 strategic imperatives. And one of those is to deepen our commitment to the most vulnerable boys and girls. For the first 10 years of this strategy, we were focused on shifting the whole program away from where we felt comfortable to where we were going to be challenged and where the most vulnerability was evident. So now more than 1/3 of World Vision's funding globally is allocated to fragile and conflict contexts, and that's up from just 22% in 2016. And 60% of the children that are reached through our programming are considered by World Vision, and importantly by their own communities, as being the most vulnerable. And that's up from an average of around 20 to 30% at the start of the Our Promise strategy. So we really are, as an organisation globally, shifting to focus on precisely the sorts of contexts that have been addressed in this presentation so far. Next slide, please. So if we're going to continue to live out that promise of working with the most vulnerable, it's almost a no-brainer to say that we're going to be working with women and children in conflict and fragile settings. More than 1 in 3 women globally experience gender-based violence. And in times of emergencies, be that natural disasters or pandemics, as we saw with COVID, in warfare and in displacement, as we see every day in tiny snippets of news about what's happening in Sudan, and as was presented by our colleagues here in Ukraine, this figure only increases in times of conflict. For World Vision US's Humanitarian Affairs Acquisition Team, where we're fundraising for programming in humanitarian action, preventing and addressing gender-based violence is integrated into all programs. I manage a team of senior technical advisors who work with various sector teams and with the HEA team to ensure that gender is a lens that we apply to every single program. Some of the trends that I think we're seeing now were mentioned, Julia mentioned earlier about male engagement, particularly I think with adolescents. If we are to break this cycle, we need to get into working with not only young girls, but also young boys and men in changing the social norms and the cultural norms that perpetuate or allow gender-based violence to perpetuate. The other place for World Vision, I think, going forward is working with faith actors. How do they integrate? How do we support them to be able to support survivors and to, again, address those social norms that lead to gender-based violence? Next slide, please. So we work with the funding for programming in conflict areas tends to come from two major sources. That's our private donors, and I've just listed a couple of them there. Many of these folks and organisations and foundations share our aspiration to prevent gender-based violence. One of those in particular at the moment is the Purpose Project, funded by the Vista Hermosa Foundation, and that's working to integrate gender-based violence prevention, response, and continuum protection, in the continuum of care, looking to address root causes of violence and protect the most vulnerable, and respond to incidents when they occur. And we focus here on the survivor needs and the accountability of perpetrators. The project has worked with refugee and displaced populations in Bangladesh, Ethiopia, Kenya, and Honduras. And we also incorporate economic empowerment strategies, particularly for vulnerable women and girls, as well as social behaviour and norm change for men and boys. And also here promoting strategies to integrate faith actors into that continuum of care. Next slide, please. Our main public donors, the Department of State, Bureau of Population, Refugees and Migration, and USAID's Bureau of Humanitarian Affairs. We've done a lot of interesting work on prevention or protection rather of from sexual exploitation and abuse within aid distribution, funded through the State Department. I think it's beholden upon agencies working in humanitarian contexts to ensure that their own staff are not perpetuating gender-based violence, as we've seen some fairly prominent incidents of that in the past. We'll continue to be working with these two offices, aiming to expand our work. I think it's a high priority across all of our sectors to be more working in fragile and emergency contexts and to be working on gender-based violence. Certainly one of the things that's going to strengthen our chances of being successful in those bids is the sort of research that we've seen here today, having those voices from those who are being impacted by the gender-based violence and evidence or recommendations on what works really improves our credibility and hopefully means more money flowing the way of those programs. I'll just end quickly with the next slide, Abby. One thing for the US, of course, is we have a change of administration coming up as we move from the 46th to the 47th president. So everything's a little bit up in the air at the moment until the policies and strategies of the new administration become clear. So it's all a bit wait and see at the moment. But I do hope that these sorts of critical areas of work will continue to be funded well going forward. Thank you.
Great, thanks. Thanks, Karen, and thanks for highlighting, the importance of working with partners externally to influence, the prevention and response in the communities where we're working, but also the responsibility as organizations for ensuring our staff aren't perpetuating gender-based violence or exploiting vulnerable populations through aid distribution. That's a very important part of work that we ensure as organizations, that we are also functioning in a way that enables prevention and appropriate response to GBV. Well, great. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, panelists, speakers, for your really important highlights, the things you highlighted throughout the presentations. We really just saw how important data is for appropriately responding, understanding the needs and priorities of diverse groups of adolescents and adults, and responding in using that data to inform our responses. I'm very excited now we can have a chance for question and answer. And some of you have put some questions in the chat or in the Q&A box, which we appreciate. I will start with the first question that we got from Vanita or Darina. Apart from working on this research, what is NGO's Girls' experience of collaboration with World Vision and other international and local actors in Ukraine? So based on the research recommendation that it should be improved, what would you like us as World Vision and other INGOs to do differently?
Thank you, Vanita, a lot for these amazing questions. Questions, there are a few of them. Yeah, so we've been privileged to collaborate with World Vision for 3 years right now, and they're really big, impactful projects. In most of them, we established safe spaces for children and adolescents, and basis on which we conducted psychosocial rehabilitation, sports, but also support for those who were survivors of GBV, as case management. As for collaboration with other international and local actors, in terms of GBV, for example, we partnered with UNICEF, where we developed amazing handbooks on sex education. And I also drop a message in the chat for participants to check and maybe use it for your work. So we basically use these handbooks where we conduct lessons on sex education at schools. And that's also part of our work in prevention of GBV for adolescents and children. In terms of collaboration for local actors, we enter consortium together. We together advocate and collaborate with government authorities. But also we have trainings for aimed at capacity strengthening for those Ukrainian NGOs which are smaller, especially women's rights organizations. The last question, that was really good one. What is the room for improvement that we see? I would say that for many INGOs, you have the access to international advocacy or to platforms where advocacy can be led and done on a global level. So I would encourage you and other partners to invite local actors and local organizations to participate in these spaces. Like Ukrainian Recovery Conference is one of the examples, and it's good that the previous year there were a few attendants from Ukraine, but not as many, to be honest. Yeah, and also to provide trainings for small organizations, because we understand that our international partners cannot stay in Ukraine forever. So while you are here, we should learn the best practices from you. Yeah, that's what I think.
Great, thank you. That's a great point of thinking through ways that, we as INGOs or INGO partners have spaces that we can help link local partners to those spaces to speak about the issues that they see and they find important. So thanks for highlighting that. That's a very tangible way you can see, or suggestion for improvement. All right, thank you. I have another question that I'm going to direct to Gita. So how can we ensure that our GBV prevention programs are more tailored to adolescent needs, specifically girls, as you highlighted in your presentation, since it is evident from your recent research or your study that they are the most vulnerable? So what can we do? What can, people are thinking about, how do we tailor programs? What suggestions do you have?
That's a really great question. Thank you so much, Abby. And the person who posed that question. It's very obvious that girls emphasize certain systemic nature to GBV in the responses, and they comfortably point to patriarchal cultures and that kind of power imbalance within the society, whereas adolescent males are farther along to actually discover that. It would be pertinent for us to create material that would help an adolescent navigate such forms of GBV, because having just family to go to is extremely limiting, and it also it adds complex layers to the interaction and to the kind of social contracts that are negotiated between parents and their adolescents about what may happen or not, because they are supposed to be the protectors. And so it really blurs the line. So it's very important that there are other actors like girls and NGOs and others, academic circles, communities, community leaders, and our faith actors who are partners to World Vision take action on material that is tailored to these kinds of experiences. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Gita. And that's really important and good ideas. And so I have another question that for Julia that I'd like to ask. As you were talking, you were mentioning the importance of not just highlighting programs for girls or boys separately, but bringing them together. And so I'm curious to hear how you've seen, various programs bring together boys and girls into spaces for specific conversations or activities, actions. What have been the outcomes of these programs specifically for the relationships that are fostered between girls and boys?
Thanks, Abby. It's a great question. And I think I've seen where we're intentional about bringing boys and girls together, especially in Impact Plus clubs. I think it's good for the community to see boys and girls partnering together, but it's also good for adolescents to be working together. So I'll give you one example from our Impact Plus clubs in Sri Lanka. There are some contexts in Sri Lanka that are Muslim and highly religious contexts. And when World Vision Sri Lanka and their partners started Impact Plus clubs, there was reticence on the behalf of parents and caregivers and teachers on bringing girls and boys together in these clubs. And within a few months, the parents and teachers were actually changing their tune right away, because they were seeing that not only were children, helping the community, but girls' confidence was getting bigger. Both boys and girls were being more helpful in the home as a result of their skills building and their relationships in these clubs. I also think that there's something to be said around the participation and contribution aspect of positive youth development, of not just learning in a fun environment together, but then also so they're kind of facing each other, and we have specific content on peer relationships, gender relationships, violence in relationships. And so they're learning these specific skills in the same environment together and kind of taking each other on in challenging ways rather than in separate ways. But then when they go into the community and do service learning projects or community initiatives, they're going from looking at each other and facing each other and learning together to then turning outward together as partners into their communities. And so also I think that there's something to be said for communities observing boys and girls working together for change in their communities. One of my favorite images that I often bring to mind is, again, in Sri Lanka, a community service learning project where a club decided to rebuild the home of one of their members that had gotten destroyed in a monsoon. And the picture is boys and girls doing construction side side by side for their community. So I think that it's both end of working together, looking at each other as it were, but then turning outward together as partners has a huge impact.
Mm-hmm. That's great. Thank you so much, Julia. That's important to think about how them working together kind of influences the relationships. Let's see, we had one question I have two more questions. So one that I'll direct to Karen, but first there's a question in the Q&A that I think is important to address. And it says, I work in Moldova with Ukrainian women who have been affected by gender-based violence. How can we get more services here as well? I'm finding it hard to engage them outside Ukraine. So I'd like to open this to any panelists who would like to provide suggestions or thoughts to this question. Anyone have a recommendation or thoughts?
I personally do not have any recommendations, but surprisingly, I'm at Moldova right now, and there are lots of colleagues. Some of them, I think, also work in the topic of GBV prevention. So if you can please write your email, I will try to connect. I cannot promise that something will, I don't know, will happen out of this, but that's what I can propose, and maybe as a panelist, we can give their thoughts.
Thank you. That's great.
Abby,
Yeah,
I would just like to add that World Vision Ukraine Crisis Response does cover Moldova, but unfortunately Arman is no longer with us, I think, but I will try to type in the chat some more details about our activities there and how they can reach out to us. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much. Thank you for that. And, I think this question is really important because there are so many barriers to accessing services, even when you're in your country of, where you're a citizen. But then when you are displaced or outside of your own, kind of social circles, barriers to services are increased. And so I think linking with others who are working in this space is great. So thank you, panelists, for jumping in. All right, I have one last question before we take time to close for Karen. And Karen, what are some recommendations that you have for offices and local partners looking to receive more funding from donors for their GBV programming? And any ideas of how they can sustain this funding in long term for more sustainable outcomes? Karen, are you? Oh, we can't hear you. We see you're speaking, but we can't hear you. Oh, yeah, we still can't hear you. All right. Well, sorry about that. I don't know if, we heard you fine before, but now you're silenced. So we'll have to take a rain check on that question. And maybe if we have, you could write in the chat just a brief idea if you have any concrete suggestions for participants. Yeah, so I think we've come to the end of our webinar. We've covered a lot of topics and ground through the last, almost 80 minutes. And so I'd like to take time to thank our speakers and panelists for the amazing work that you're doing. The commitment, especially to our partner from NGO Girls, to ensuring women and girls and men and boys receive services for GBV, and really seeking to understand the context so you can respond appropriately. It's just amazing to hear how you're doing that. So I just want to thank you all for the work that you're doing first and foremost. And then thank you all as panelists and speakers for joining this webinar, taking time out of your busy schedules to prepare presentations and share your learning and knowledge with us. It's invaluable. And there are so many things, as you are highlighting the work in Ukraine, that we can take going forward. And yeah, we just want to say thank you all to participants who have joined the webinar. You can see the finalized report online. We've been sending it around, so hopefully you've had a chance to review it. But there is also the report on adolescent girls on hidden struggles. And that will be finalized in, I believe, tomorrow, if I remember correctly. And so we'll share that around as well. So there's some really interesting reading, things that we can pull from the Ukraine experience and apply in other locations. And so, yeah, thank you everyone for your time and your efforts. It's been great to be with you, and I wish you all a good evening, afternoon, or morning, wherever you are. And thank you.